Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every week on all aspects of the past. Today on History Calling we're looking at the life of Will Sommer, also known as Will Sommers, who was the court jester or fool of Henry VIII and who also worked at the courts of Henry's children Edward, Mary and possibly Elizabeth. The history of the Tudors is usually told through the eyes of members of the royal family and aristocracy, but Will is one of the most famous commoners of that era, whose name and image appears in the monarch's financial accounts and several Tudor family paintings, as well as later works of fiction about Henry's court. Using this evidence, I'll reconstruct for you what we really know about this man, and consider whether or not he may have been physically and/or mentally disabled. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on so that YouTube lets you know when I upload. You can also follow me on Instagram, which is linked in the description box, and if you would like to support me further, you have the option to make a one-off donation using the thanks button below this video. That will enable you to post a customizable and brightly coloured comment and get a one-time animation over the top of the video. Will Sommer first appears in the records of Henry VIII's court on the 28th of June 1535, when the king was ordering that his tailor and the various people responsible for making and sending clothes and fabrics to him be paid for their services. Amongst a list of items purchased for Henry and his wife Anne Boleyn, there was also a payment, quote, for gowns, coats, etc., which were for the use of a number of servants, including, quote, William Sommer, the king's fool. We don't know where he came from or how old he was, though a record from 1543 said he was of full age, meaning over 21, so he must have been born in 1522 or earlier. From 1535 onwards, Will would continue to appear in the royal records as Henry's reign gave way to Edward VI, then Mary I, then Elizabeth I. Most of these mentions have to do with clothing paid for him by his royal masters and mistresses, and J.R. Mulrine has pointed out in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography that we know more about Will Sommer's attire than the man himself. I'm not going to list every item bought for him here, as that would get very boring very fast, but I will give you a few examples. Henry paid for a velvet purse to be made for his fool in 1538, though clothes and accessories weren't the only thing Will owned. Henry also made payments for the care of Sommer's horse in December 1546. In 1551, Edward VI's financial records mention gloves and a pair of hosen for William. Hosen are like light trousers or tights, think of the word hosiery, plus a copper chain double gilded. That same year he was bought, quote, one suit of white and blue bodkin guarded with red satin, a frock of tawny silk striped with gold, furred about the neck. When Edward died in 1553, Will was given black clothing to wear whilst walking in the young king's funeral procession. Mary I took good care of him too. He had a new blue satin outfit lined with fur for her coronation, and less than a month before her death in 1558 she ordered the following for him: 7 ounces and a half of silk, 1 gross of buttons with stalks, 8 tassels of green and yellow silk, 2 ells of holland cloth, 10 pair of linen hose, 5 pair of buckram hose, half a dozen of handkerchiefs, and 3 dozen of round buttons. There was a further payment to Richard Tisdale, tailor, for making of 2 green coats for William Sommer our fool, the one guarded with velvet and the other plain, both lined with cotton, for making of 2 canvas doublets for him lined with buckram, and for making of a gown of green damask guarded with yellow velvet, and for making of a jerkin of same damask likewise guarded with yellow velvet. Will was therefore a well-dressed man, sporting silks, furs, damasks and velvets. The mention of handkerchiefs being purchased for him, and this wasn't the only time Queen Mary made such a purchase on his behalf, has struck some commentators as odd though. Charlotte Stopes, writing in 1914, tells us that other retainers do not seem to have had similar grants, while Mulrine writes that this was presumably intended for wiping nose and mouth to deal with a natural condition or illness. We have no idea what this possible condition was, but it could have been something as simple as a mild allergy or frequent colds. Will's last documented appearance was at Elizabeth I's coronation in January 1559, and we don't know if he continued to work as a fool for her after that, or if this signalled his retirement. He died on the 15th of June 1560 and was buried in St Leonard's in Shoreditch in London. Although his exact grave location is unknown, he is commemorated on a memorial plaque placed there in 1913 by the London Shakespeare League, along with other actors, musicians and entertainers of the Tudor and Stuart eras. Though most primary sources are concerned with his possessions, there are some which offer us more detail about Sommer, his life and his background, and which can be used to make some educated guesses about his mental and physical faculties. In July 1535, the imperial ambassador to England, Eustace Chapuis, wrote that King Henry the other day nearly murdered his own fool, a simple and innocent man, because he happened to speak well in his presence of the Queen and Princess, that's Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary, and called the concubine Ribaude, which means whore, and her daughter Bastard. These are references to Anne Boleyn and Princess Elizabeth. He has now been banished from court and has gone to the Grand Esquire, meaning Sir Nicholas Carew, who has sheltered and hidden him. Clearly then, Will wasn't always in Henry's good graces, but it's Chapuis' description of him as, quote, simple and innocent, and the nature of his faux pas in front of the king, which are really eye-catching. The ambassador is a good contemporary source, as he would have seen Sommer in person, and his account suggests some sort of learning disability, not just because Will seemed quote-unquote simple to him, but because no one who really understood the gravity of what they were saying would have spoken to Henry of Queen Catherine, Queen Anne and their daughters in the way in which Will did. Other sources written during his life indicate something similar. In 1551, for instance, the account books of Edward VI record payments made to a William Satan, who had been, quote, appointed to keep Will Sommer, suggesting that Will was unable to live alone. He seems to have had little in the way of family who could care for him, though. We are aware of one sister, for she appears in financial records from the final year of Mary I's reign, when 3 yards of russet cloth were bought for her to pay for a dress, but no other living relations are mentioned in contemporary documents. There was a deceased cousin, however, named Alice Lynn, who died on the 4th of April 1523, for in November 1543 a warrant was issued confirming that Will was, quote, her next cousin and heir, who could therefore inherit her lands in the county of Hampshire worth £5 per year. This is as much as contemporary written sources tell us. There are others, written years, sometimes decades after Will's death, which purport to contain extra details of his life, though. He appears in Elizabethan and early Stuart plays, for instance, including Misogynist, which was first performed in the 1560s or 1570s, just a few years after Will's death. Then there was Thomas Nash's 1592 play, Sommer's Last Will and Testament, and Samuel Rowley's When You See Me, You Know Me, which appeared in 1605. In contrast to the contemporary sources, which suggest some sort of learning disability, in these he is presented as clever and witty and not mentally challenged in any way. Also published at the start of the 17th century, when Will was still within living memory, was Robert Armin's book Fool Upon Fool, or 6 Sorts of Sots. It includes a section on Sommer and provides a wealth of information, most of which is unverifiable. According to him, Will was born in Shropshire, which doesn't align with the cousin he had living in Hampshire, but that's not an insurmountable problem, as people did move around. Armin also says that Will was brought to Greenwich and presented to Henry on a holy day, though he offers no year. He writes that physically Sommer was lean and hollow-eyed, and says that he was widely liked at court and kept the king amused by making up rhymes and brain teasers for him. Armin also credits him with being a friend to poor men and widows, and one who could obtain favours from the king because Henry knew he would not abuse that power. These abilities and activities don't really chime with the idea of Will having the kind of learning problems that would have made him appear simple and innocent to others, or not realise the dangers of calling Queen Anne and Princess Elizabeth insulting names. But Armin does include some information which might be read as a sign that Sommer had some sort of illness which caused the rapid onset of sleep. He writes that Sommer, while, quote, walking in the park at Greenwich, fell asleep on the stile that leads into the walk. Apparently he could not be easily woken, for Armin goes on that a poor woman, seeing him sleep so dangerously, either to fall backward or hurt his head, leaning so against a post, fetched him a cushion and a rope, the one for his head and the other to bind him to the post for falling backward, and thus he slept, and the woman stood by, attending as groom of his chamber. For her pains in caring for him, Will ensured that the woman's son, who was to have been executed 3 days later for piracy, escaped the noose. The book offers more details of his supposed family too, for it records an uncle visiting him from the country, in fact this visit coincides with the sleeping incident just mentioned, who Will presented to King Henry. In the course of their meeting, it emerged that the heath upon which Will had been born, known as Terrell's Frith, had been illegally enclosed by a man of that name who claimed it as his own. However, at Will's request, the king had the Bishop of Hereford make Terrell set the frith at liberty, to quote Armin, much to the delight of the locals. There are no contemporary sources to support any of this, of course, and in other parts of the book, Armin seems to stray into out-and-out fabrication. He has Will spar with Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, for instance. However, the cardinal fell from favour and died in 1530, 5 years before we have any evidence that Will was at court. This strongly suggests that this work must be taken with a large pinch of salt. If the content of Armin's work is dubious though, the accounts of Will's life written by others are even more so. In 1676, over a century after his death, an anonymously authored pamphlet entitled A Pleasant History of the Life and Death of Will Sommers provided what appears to be an almost completely imagined account of Will's life. In this publication, he is presented as a very quick-witted individual with no kind of disability. In fact, it specifically says that he was not a natural fool, as people with learning difficulties were referred to at the time, instead calling him one of the world's cunning and crafty fools. It says he was of low stature, with a pleasant countenance, but otherwise does not describe him physically. There follows a long list of supposed incidents from Will's time before and after he came to court, which highlight his cleverness. There are too many to read them all to you, but one stated that he once told a miller that he thought the collar of a miller's shirt was particularly valiant because it had a thief by the neck every morning. He is also supposed to have come to London because Henry VIII summoned him there, having heard of his cleverness. There are no sources given for these or any of the other tales told in this pamphlet, and many of them read like a series of scenes from a pantomime. There are also details which we know from the contemporary sources are untrue. Will is described as being married and having his own house, neither of which are mentioned in the Tudor account books, which instead have him in the care of William Satan. The chronology is all over the place too. Like Armin, who was perhaps used as a source, the author refers to Cardinal Wolsey being present during some stories, which suggests Will was at court before Wolsey's fall from grace, which occurred in 1529. Yet it also says that the first time Will met Henry, he mentioned the king having had many wives, though Henry didn't marry for the second time, let alone the 4 others, until 1533. No mention is made of Will's career after the death of Henry VIII, and the pamphlet includes a number of woodcuts of the incidents it describes, which depict the people in them in Stuart-era costumes, as you can see here. In short, believing almost anything this pamphlet says would be like watching the cartoon movie Pocahontas and treating it as real history. A few of the names and core details, such as the fact that Will worked for Henry as a court jester, are true, but otherwise it's a fairy tale. In the 19th century, another book, this time written by one James Granger and entitled A Biographical History of England from Egbert the Great to the Revolution, mentioned Will. Granger claimed that the court fool had previously been in the employ of Richard Farmer of Northamptonshire, an ancestor to the Earl of Pomfret, but offers no source to support this claim, and there is no more reason to believe him than there is to believe the 1676 pamphlet. Next, we have the visual sources. Though some of the pictures I've been showing you in this video are later imaginings of Will, several are contemporaneous with his lifetime, or are known to be copies of such images, and it's those which we'll focus on here. The first is in a Psalter, which is a book of Psalms, belonging to Henry VIII, and it shows the king and Will together. The British Library dates this to somewhere between 1530 and Henry's death in 1547. However, looking at the king's aged and overweight appearance, I think it dates to the later end of that range, and the Oxford DMB says it belongs to 1540. Plus, of course, we know that Will likely wasn't at court before 1535. The picture appears on a page alongside Psalm 52, and in line with the content of that psalm, Henry is depicted as the biblical figure of David with a harp. Will is not wearing a jester's outfit and instead appears in everyday clothing. This consists of a green hooded coat over a white shirt with black embroidery around the neckline and cuffs and blue hosen and black shoes. A black purse or bag hangs on his belt. Physically, he is of medium build and one shoulder appears to sit higher than the other, suggesting he may have had scoliosis just as Richard III did. As well as the questions already raised regarding his mental abilities, this hints at another reason he may have been singled out to become the king's court jester or fool. For those with physical characteristics such as this, which set them apart from most other people, were often seen as a source of ridicule or amusement. He has short brown hair with a hint of grey at his temples and greying stubble on his face, suggesting he could be middle-aged. His hands are clasped in front of him in a seemingly worried gesture. Writing in 2010, and I'll leave details of her article below, historian Sandra Petrini argues that his depiction stresses his intellectual inferiority, despite the fact that she believes him to have been an artificial fool, that is, a buffoon pretending folly. He is not presented in a demeaning way, however, nor does he appear to be acting the fool. Instead, we see an image of one of the few people Henry wasn't related to, but who he liked and trusted enough to be depicted alongside. The next image is a painting created in about 1545 called The Family of Henry VIII, which again shows Henry with his surviving children and the long-dead Jane Seymour, rather than his actual wife at the time, who was Catherine Parr. In the far left of the image, we see a woman who is believed to have been one of Prince Edward's nurses, known as Mother Jack, and on the far right, we see Will Sommer. He is in profile and is again seen with brown hair, though this time his face is clean-shaven and his overall appearance is more youthful. He wears a brownish-green coat over red hosen and a purse or satchel at his belt. This is no court jester costume though, in fact his hosen actually match those worn by Prince Edward, and instead his clothes are of a much higher quality and cut than most people in the country could ever have afforded. However, he is represented as a more stereotypical fool, for he carries a monkey on his shoulders, seemingly in reference to his position at court. The next image is one of King Henry, his 3 surviving children, and Will. Given the appearance of Henry, the apparent age of Prince Edward, and the style of clothing being worn by the sitters in this picture, it is meant to be a depiction of these people during the final few years of Henry's life. Its history is a little complicated though. There does exist a painted version of this image, which was rediscovered in 2008 and which caused quite the stir, as it is also one of the very small number of portraits of Elizabeth I before she was queen. See the news article on this discovery, which I'll link in the description box for you. However, even that painted version only dates to about 1650 to 1680, and the original that it and this print were based on is lost. What we're looking at is therefore not a contemporary image, yet we know that it is based on one. Will stands behind the royal family, and as most of his body is blocked, we see no hint of any issue with his shoulders. He has dark hair, which is more obvious in the painted version, but the lines on his face make it appear that he is older than this uniform hair colour might suggest. Another 16th century, yet posthumous image of Henry, Will and Mary, which bears some striking similarities to the previous one in terms of their poses and clothing, has him appear even older. The lines on his face are more pronounced, and he carries a stick, perhaps to aid in walking. Of all the images of him, it is this one which most clearly evokes the hollow-eyed description given of him by Armin. His clothing emphasises once again that green seems to have been a favoured colour to dress him in, and his hooded coat is remarkably similar to that seen in the Psalter image. He also holds a small dog. Whether this was because this was a real pet of his, or because it was seen as the kind of prop that a court jester might have, is unknown. What is beyond dispute, though, is his favoured position with the royal family, all of whom he is close enough to touch, both in this picture and the previous one. Having taken all of these sources into account, what conclusions can we draw about Will and the kind of life he led at the Tudor court? First, I would say that I think he probably did have some sort of learning disability. Chapuis's first-hand account of the 1535 incident is not to be dismissed lightly, and there is no reason to doubt his assessment of Will as being, quote, simple and innocent. The need for a keeper for what was clearly a grown man only confirms this notion further to me, and the sources which depict him as a wit were all written after his death. Second, he may or may not have had a physical issue. The only image of him, which shows a slightly raised shoulder, is a small drawing in a psalter, in which Henry hardly looks his most majestic either, despite the rich clothes. We may just be seeing a not particularly well executed drawing. Finally, though it is impossible to know what his day-to-day life was like, Will seems to have been looked upon with fondness by his royal employers. He was well dressed, his family were taken care of when necessary, and he was included in multiple royal family portraits by Henry. He also survived the courts of 4 Tudor monarchs, each inheriting him from the last and apparently quite happy to do so. Though their treatment of him as a fool due to a learning disability is abhorrent to modern eyes, by the very different standards of the 16th century, he was dealt with kindly, and he must surely be looked on as one of the great survivors of the Tudor era, who saw courtier after courtier go to the scaffold while he carried on. Do you agree with these conclusions, though? Let me know in the comments below how likely you think it is that Will had a learning disability, and if you'd like to learn more about the Tudors, try one of these videos next. I'll be back next week with a new offering, and until then, keep learning.